are confessions that live quietly inside you for years, buried beneath routine, responsibilities, and carefully curated smiles. And then there are confessions that claw at your ribs every single night until speaking them aloud becomes the only way to survive. This is mine. I never imagined that the strongest marriage of my life would be tested not by betrayal, not by lies, not by another woman, but by a request so devastating, so intimate, and so impossible that even now, years later, I still struggle to understand the man who made it. My name is Alara. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed I had won the lottery in love. I met my husband, Nathan, when I was 24, standing in line at a bookstore in Portland during a rainstorm. He was tall, intelligent, slightly awkward, and carrying 3 novels he would later admit he had no intention of buying. He had simply wanted an excuse to keep talking to me. It worked. Our relationship unfolded with the kind of ease most people only pretend to have. We laughed often, we fought rarely, we built a life slowly, intentionally, with mutual respect stitched into every corner of our home. Nathan was the kind of man who warmed my car on freezing mornings, the kind who remembered my coffee order after one date, the kind who would wake up in the middle of the night if I even shifted uncomfortably. For 7 years, he was my safest place. And then came the question every married couple eventually faces: children. At first, we were relaxed about it. We traveled, we focused on our careers, we enjoyed being selfish together. But eventually, we were ready. Or at least I thought we were. Months passed, then a year, then 18 months. Each negative test became a tiny funeral. I stopped buying wine just in case. I started timing everything: cycles, temperatures, ovulation windows. Romance slowly transformed into scheduling. Nathan remained supportive, but something in him changed. A subtle tightening around his eyes, a reluctance to discuss appointments, a new habit of staring out windows when he thought I wasn't looking. I assumed he was disappointed. I had no idea he was terrified. The fertility specialist suggested standard testing. It was routine, she assured us. Nothing invasive, nothing to fear. Nathan agreed immediately. Too immediately. A week later, he came home from work carrying an envelope. I was cooking dinner when he handed it to me. His hands were trembling. I remember the smell of garlic in the pan, the low hum of the refrigerator, the way the kitchen light reflected off the countertop. Normal details, frozen forever against the moment my world shifted. His results were conclusive. Nathan had suffered severe reproductive damage from an accident he'd been in at 19, an injury he had always described as minor, something I had never thought to question. He was infertile. Not unlikely, not difficult, impossible. I cried for him before I cried for us. That distinction matters, because his grief was immediate, masculine, and all-consuming. It attacked his sense of identity with surgical precision. He wasn't just mourning fatherhood, he was mourning himself. The weeks that followed were brutal. Nathan withdrew in ways I had never seen. He avoided family gatherings, he ignored calls from friends, he stopped making eye contact when pregnancy announcements appeared online. I suggested therapy. He refused. I suggested IVF with a donor. He refused even harder. He couldn't bear the thought of medical records, legal paperwork, clinical procedures. He was convinced that using an anonymous donor would somehow expose his infertility to everyone around us. His pride was wounded in a place no one could see, which somehow made it worse. I tried to be patient. I tried to understand. Then, one Friday evening, he came home with a bottle of wine and an expression I couldn't decipher. There was a strange calm about him, the kind that usually precedes storms. We sat on our back patio while the sun dissolved into streaks of orange over the neighborhood. He barely touched his drink. Finally, he spoke. He told me he had found a solution. I remember feeling relieved, hopeful even, until he explained it. He wanted me to become pregnant naturally, just not with him. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. Then he said the name. Ethan, his best friend since college, the man who had stood beside him at our wedding, the man who came over for football every Sunday, the man whose wife had died 3 years ago, leaving him emotionally adrift but fiercely loyal to Nathan. I laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. Nathan didn't. He was completely serious. The logic, in his mind, was airtight. Ethan was healthy, intelligent, trustworthy, and physically similar enough that no one would ever suspect. It would remain private. No clinics, no paperwork, no strangers. A child biologically connected to someone Nathan loved. A secret contained within the walls of friendship. I felt physically ill. I asked if he was joking. He wasn't. I asked if grief had broken him. He insisted it had clarified him. I suggested IVF using donor sperm. He rejected it immediately, again citing privacy, pride, and his inability to face the humiliation of medical intervention. Humiliation. That word still echoes in my memory, because apparently my body becoming the battleground for his wounded masculinity seemed less humiliating to him than a doctor knowing the truth. I was horrified, not simply by the request itself, but by how carefully he had considered it. How long had he been thinking about this? How many silent dinners had concealed this plan? How many nights had he lain beside me, imagining his best friend in my place? The thought unsettled me in ways I still struggle to articulate. Nathan wasn't asking for infidelity, he was asking for sacrifice, for partnership, for something far more complicated than betrayal, and that made it infinitely harder to reject. I told him absolutely not. I expected anger. Instead, he became persuasive, gentle, reasonable. He spoke about legacy, about family, about how biology mattered less than love, about how Ethan would never interfere. He framed it as an act of devotion, an unconventional solution to an unconventional problem. I went to bed that night feeling like I no longer recognized the man sleeping beside me. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been grief-talking, a temporary madness, an emotional collapse. I was wrong, because Nathan brought it up again, and again, and again. Weeks passed. His requests evolved into discussions. Discussions became arguments. Arguments became pressure. He never shouted, he never threatened, but persistence can become its own form of coercion. He began presenting practical details, as if planning a vacation. Timing, boundaries, discretion. He had even, somehow, already spoken to Ethan. That revelation shattered something inside me. Ethan knew? Ethan had been approached? Ethan had agreed to consider it. I couldn't breathe. The humiliation was overwhelming. I avoided Ethan for nearly a month after learning that. Then came Thanksgiving. Nathan insisted we attend Ethan's family gathering. I spent the entire evening hyper-aware of every glance, every accidental touch, every moment Ethan and I occupied the same room. He was respectful. Painfully so. He barely looked at me, which somehow made it worse. On the drive home, Nathan asked what I thought, as if we were reviewing a restaurant. I stared out the window and wondered how my life had become unrecognizable in under 6 months. That night, I slept in the guest room, not because I was angry, because I was afraid. Afraid that if I stayed beside him, I might begin normalizing the absurd. And the truly dangerous thing about love is that it can make almost anything seem reasonable if given enough time. A week later, Ethan called me, not Nathan. Ethan. He asked if we could meet, just once, just to talk. I should have refused. Instead, I said yes. I told myself it was for closure, for clarity, for boundaries. But deep down, I think some part of me needed to understand why two intelligent men could possibly believe this was a solution. I met him at a quiet coffee shop downtown on a rainy Tuesday. He looked exhausted, older, burdened. He apologized before sitting down. He said he never would have agreed if Nathan hadn't been unraveling. He said Nathan had cried, begged, confessed fears Ethan had never heard him speak aloud. Fear of inadequacy, fear of losing me, fear that I would eventually resent him for the life we couldn't have. Ethan wasn't eager, he was loyal, and loyalty, I've learned, can be almost as dangerous as desperation. We talked for nearly 2 hours. He never pressured me, never suggested I agree, but when he finally said, "Whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision," something shifted inside me, because until then, I hadn't realized how much Nathan's grief had consumed my own agency. I drove home in silence. Nathan was waiting, hopeful, terrified. He asked one question. Had Ethan been respectful? I said yes. Then I went upstairs without another word. That night, as Nathan slept, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering whether marriage was truly about sharing burdens or about surviving the impossible requests that burdens create. I wish I knew what to do. I didn't, because 3 days later, Nathan made a confession of his own, and it changed everything I thought I knew about my husband. 3 days after my meeting with Ethan, Nathan came home earlier than usual. I heard his car pull into the driveway just after 4, the familiar crunch of tires on gravel sending a ripple of unease through me. He rarely left the office before 6. When the front door opened, I was standing at the kitchen island slicing strawberries, pretending that routine could still anchor me. He looked exhausted, not the ordinary kind of tired that follows a long workday, but the hollow, weathered fatigue of a man who had spent too many mates fighting himself. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase down, and stood there in the entryway as though unsure whether he belonged in his own home. That frightened me more than anything, because Nathan had always belonged everywhere he stood. He asked if we could talk. Those 5 words had become dangerous in our marriage. I nodded, setting the knife aside. We sat in the living room, the same couch where we'd spent countless Sunday mornings drinking coffee and arguing playfully about movie endings. That evening, it felt like unfamiliar territory. Nathan clasped his hands together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Then he told me the truth. The accident he had described all those years ago, the one during his sophomore year of college, had not been minor. It had nearly killed him. A drunk driver had run a red light at 60 miles an hour. Nathan's car had spun across 2 lanes before slamming into a concrete divider. He had spent 12 days in the hospital and 3 months recovering. The physical injuries had been severe. The emotional damage had been worse. He had learned during those endless weeks of follow-up appointments that fathering children naturally might never be possible. At 19, the news had felt abstract, distant, a future problem for a future version of himself. So he buried it. He rebuilt his life around the assumption that perhaps doctors could be wrong, that medicine would advance, that miracles happened. And when we met, he convinced himself there was no reason to revisit the possibility. He never told me because, in his words, he had desperately wanted to be the man I believed he was. I sat frozen, not because he was infertile, that part I had already mourned, but because he had carried this secret through every anniversary, every whispered conversation about baby names, every hopeful month we had spent trying. He had let me blame myself, not intentionally perhaps, but passively, and sometimes passive wounds cut deepest. Nathan cried. It was only the second time I had ever seen him do that. The first had been at his mother's funeral. He told me he had watched my face every time another pregnancy test came back negative. He had listened as I wondered whether stress, age, or hormones were somehow failing us. Each time, guilt had eaten him alive. Yet he had remained silent, because admitting the truth would mean confronting the possibility that I might leave. I should have been furious. Part of me was. But another part, a larger, softer, more exhausted part, simply saw a frightened young man who had never truly recovered from learning that his body had betrayed him. Fear makes liars of otherwise good people. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. Nathan apologized for pressuring me. He admitted that his proposal had been less about practicality and more about panic. The closer he came to accepting infertility, the more desperate he had become to control the outcome. He wasn't trying to outrun intimacy with logistics. He was trying to outrun shame. That distinction mattered. Still, I couldn't ignore what he had asked of me, what he was still asking. He reached for my hand. I let him take it. Then he said something I wasn't prepared for. He had already drafted legal documents. My breath caught. Not formal contracts, but agreements, prepared by an attorney friend under the guise of hypothetical family planning. They outlined parental rights, financial obligations, confidentiality, and Ethan's complete relinquishment of any future claim. Nathan had thought of everything, every detail, every consequence, every safeguard, except, apparently, my sanity. I didn't know whether to be impressed or horrified, perhaps both. He told me he hadn't shown Ethan the papers yet. He wanted my consent first. Consent, such a simple word, such a complicated reality. That night I asked Nathan a question I had been avoiding. Why Ethan? He didn't hesitate, because Ethan was the only man he trusted enough to step into something so deeply personal without exploiting it. He knew Ethan would respect boundaries. He knew Ethan would never use it against us. And, perhaps most importantly, he knew he would do it purely out of love for him. Friendship, in its purest form, can be astonishing. It can also be utterly reckless. I asked whether he had considered what this might do to all three of us. He said he had considered little else. I wanted certainty. Instead, I found complexity. The following week was the longest of my life. Nathan stopped bringing it up. That almost made it worse. The silence became its own kind of pressure. At work, I found myself staring blankly at spreadsheets while my mind replayed impossible scenarios. At home, ordinary tasks felt surreal. Folding laundry, loading the dishwasher, watering plants, all while contemplating whether I might one day conceive my husband's child with another man. Life has a cruel sense of timing. It was during that week that my younger sister, Marissa, announced her second pregnancy. The family dinner was filled with congratulations, laughter, and ultrasound photos passed around the table. Nathan smiled brilliantly. No one noticed the way his fingers trembled against his wine glass. I did. That night, he stood in our darkened kitchen long after everyone had gone home. I found him staring at the backyard. He looked impossibly alone. And that was the moment my anger began to fracture. Not disappear, fracture. Love rarely survives untouched by pain, but it often adapts around the cracks. A few days later, Ethan invited both of us to dinner. Neutral territory. A small Italian restaurant on the east side, quiet enough for privacy. I nearly declined. Nathan gently asked me to come, so I did. Ethan was different that night. Not awkward, not overly careful, simply honest. He made it clear that he would walk away immediately if I was uncomfortable. He emphasized that my marriage came first. Always. There would be no expectations, no emotional entanglements, no hidden agendas. He would help only if I wanted help. His sincerity disarmed me. This wasn't fantasy. It wasn't opportunism. It was somehow an act of sacrifice from all directions. And that made it even harder. After dinner, Nathan stepped away to take a phone call, leaving Ethan and me alone for several minutes. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy. He finally admitted that he had initially refused Nathan outright. For weeks, Nathan had persisted, not with manipulation, but with vulnerability Ethan had never witnessed before. Apparently, my husband had once told him that losing the possibility of fatherhood felt like losing the future version of himself he had imagined since childhood. That sentence broke something open inside me, because beneath all the logistics, all the pride, all the unconventional planning, there was simply grief. Raw, masculine, often inarticulate grief. I drove home that night understanding Nathan better than I had in months, which was deeply inconvenient. Compassion complicates decisions. A week later, I scheduled an appointment with our fertility specialist alone. I needed facts, real ones. She listened without judgment, though I suspect my situation ranked among the more unusual consultations of her career. She reiterated the medical safety and predictability of donor-assisted IVF. She also acknowledged that some couples pursued private arrangements for personal reasons. When I asked whether such arrangements ever worked, she gave an answer that stayed with me. They work when everyone is honest about what they want, and they fail when even one person isn't. Honesty, it sounds so simple. It almost never is. That evening, I shared the appointment details with Nathan. He listened carefully, then for the first time, he agreed to consider IVF if I ultimately refused Ethan. That mattered more than he realized. It told me he valued me more than his pride, even if it had taken him too long to show it. Days turned into weeks. The question remained unanswered. Then Then, one rainy Saturday afternoon, Nathan and I visited Ethan at his lake house. The three of us spent hours talking, not about logistics, but about life, college memories, travel, books, loss, hope. At some point, Nathan went inside to answer a work email, leaving Ethan and me alone on the dock. The lake was perfectly still. Gray clouds reflected across the surface like brushed steel. Ethan told me something that startled me. He had loved his late wife enough to know that intimacy without emotional connection was possible, but never simple. He warned me that agreeing would change things no matter how carefully we planned. Bodies remember, hearts complicate, secrets grow roots. He wasn't trying to scare me, he was trying to protect me. That honesty made him more trustworthy and infinitely more dangerous, because trust, I've learned, is the foundation upon which impossible decisions are built. That night, Nathan and I made love for the first time in nearly 2 months, slowly, tenderly, as though both of us were trying to memorize what had existed before grief rearranged our marriage. Afterward, he held me so tightly that I could feel his heartbeat against my spine. He whispered that he would accept whatever I chose. I believed him, which meant the choice was finally mine, entirely mine, and that was somehow the most terrifying part of all. 2 days later, I called Ethan. I asked if he could meet me one last time. He agreed. We met at a quiet park just outside town. The leaves had begun turning amber, carpeting the walking paths in soft gold. I told him I still didn't know what I would decide. He said uncertainty was wisdom wearing patience. That sounded exactly like something Ethan would say. Before we parted, he asked one question. Did I still trust Nathan? The answer came faster than I expected. Yes. Hurt, confused, and occasionally infuriated, but yes. That trust was the only reason any of this remained conceivable. That evening, I returned home to find Nathan sitting at the dining room table. A folder rested in front of him. Inside were the legal agreements, unsigned. Beside them sat a handwritten letter. It was from Nathan, several pages long. A promise, a confession, a declaration that regardless of my decision, he would spend the rest of his life earning back every ounce of trust his secrecy had damaged. I read it twice, then 3 times. When I finally looked up, Nathan was watching me with the quiet desperation of a man awaiting judgment. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached across the table and took his hand. Because sometimes love isn't certainty. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let go while standing at the edge of the unimaginable. That night, I made my decision. But before I could tell Nathan, someone knocked on our front door, and standing on our porch, drenched from the rain, was a woman neither of us had ever seen before. Rain streamed down the porch light in silver ribbons, turning the night into a blurred watercolor of shadows and reflected gold. Nathan opened the door before I could reach it. The woman standing there looked to be in her late 30s, perhaps early 40s. Dark hair plastered against her cheeks, mascara faintly smudged from the storm, an overnight bag hanging from one shoulder as though she'd been traveling for hours. But it wasn't her appearance that startled me. It was Ethan's name leaving her lips before Nathan could say a word. She asked if Ethan was there. Nathan and I exchanged a glance, a long, confused, unsettling glance. When Nathan explained that Ethan didn't live with us, her face visibly drained of color. She apologized immediately, clearly embarrassed, then explained that Ethan had once mentioned Nathan as his closest friend and had given her our address years ago in case of emergency. I had never seen her before. Nathan hadn't either. Her name was Claire. She and Ethan had apparently dated, briefly but seriously, about 18 months earlier. The relationship had ended abruptly. Not badly, according to her, but unexpectedly. And now, after months of silence, Ethan had sent her a message asking if they could talk, urgently. Then he had stopped responding. For 2 days. She had driven nearly 4 hours to find him. Something in her expression told me this wasn't merely romantic concern. This was fear. Nathan invited her inside. As she sat at our kitchen table, wrapped in one of my sweaters while rain hammered against the windows, the pieces slowly began aligning in ways none of us anticipated. Ethan had recently been distracted, withdrawn. Nathan had attributed it to work. I had assumed it was the strain of our situation. Apparently, there was much more. Claire explained that Ethan had contacted her a week earlier, confessing that he was facing a moral dilemma unlike anything he had ever encountered. He hadn't given specifics, only that he was considering helping a close friend in a way that might permanently alter multiple lives. My stomach tightened. He had been talking about us. Not recklessly, but enough. Enough that someone else now existed on the perimeter of our secret. Claire had advised caution. Then Ethan had sent one final message 2 nights earlier. A simple sentence. I may have already made the biggest mistake of my life. And then, nothing. Nathan called him immediately. No answer. Again, straight to voicemail. A 3rd time, still nothing. A strange chill settled over the room. Ethan was reliable to a fault. He returned calls. He answered texts. He did not vanish. Nathan grabbed his keys. We drove to Ethan's house with Claire following behind. The rain intensified during the 20-minute drive, windshield wipers barely keeping pace. My mind cycled through possibilities. Accident, illness, family emergency. I never considered what we would actually find. Ethan was home. His truck sat in the driveway. Lights glowed faintly through the windows. Yet he didn't answer the door. Nathan used the spare key. Inside, the house was dark, except for the kitchen light. Ethan sat alone at the dining table, an unopened bottle of whiskey beside him and a stack of papers spread across the wood. He looked up as we entered. His expression was one of pure resignation, not surprise, as if he had known this moment was inevitable. Claire rushed forward first. Relief flashed across her face, quickly followed by anger. Nathan demanded to know what was happening. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face, exhausted. Then he told us. He had gone to a doctor 3 days earlier, routine blood work, a lingering fatigue he had ignored for months. The results had led to further testing, and the diagnosis, delivered only that morning, had shattered him. Early-stage Hodgkin lymphoma. Highly treatable, excellent prognosis, but treatment would need to begin soon. Aggressive treatment. Chemotherapy. The room seemed to contract around us. Nathan sat down heavily. Claire covered her mouth. I simply stared. Life, apparently, had decided our moral crisis wasn't sufficiently complicated. Ethan explained that his doctor strongly recommended sperm banking before treatment began. There was a high likelihood of future fertility issues. A familiar irony, cruel and precise. He had been wrestling not only with Nathan's request, but with the possibility that his own biological future was suddenly uncertain. That was the mistake he had referenced to Claire. Not a choice already made, but one he feared making under the weight of illness and obligation. He needed space, time, silence. Nathan looked devastated, not because our arrangement might now be impossible, but because his best friend was sick. That distinction mattered immensely. For the first time in months, the entire question of pregnancy disappeared. What remained was friendship, loyalty, mortality. We stayed with Ethan late into the night. Claire, despite their complicated history, took immediate control of practical matters. She scheduled appointments, organized paperwork, and scolded Ethan with the efficiency of someone who had once loved him deeply enough to still care. Watching them together stirred something unexpected in me, a realization that love rarely ends cleanly. It simply changes shape. Over the next several weeks, our lives revolved around Ethan's diagnosis. Nathan accompanied him to consultations. Claire moved into Ethan's guest room temporarily. I brought meals, managed insurance calls, and learned more about oncology than I ever wished to know. The original plan, the impossible proposal that had dominated my marriage, faded into the background. But it did not disappear. If anything, Ethan's illness made the question even more emotionally loaded, because now time itself seemed uncertain. One evening, about 2 weeks after his diagnosis, Ethan asked to speak with me alone. We sat on his back porch overlooking the lake, wrapped in blankets against the November cold. He looked thinner already, more vulnerable, yet strangely at peace. He told me he had made a decision. He could not help Nathan. Not now, perhaps not ever. Not because he lacked willingness, but because entering fatherhood, however unconventional, while facing cancer would be profoundly unfair to everyone involved. I felt relief so intense it nearly brought tears, and guilt for feeling relieved. He smiled when he noticed. Apparently, my face had never been particularly good at deception. Then he said something that altered my perspective forever. Nathan had never truly needed Ethan. He had needed hope. Ethan had simply been the shape that hope temporarily took. The real challenge wasn't conception. It was acceptance. Accepting loss, accepting alternative paths, accepting that masculinity and fatherhood were not synonymous. Somehow, the man battling cancer was comforting the woman whose husband had asked the impossible. Life has a twisted sense of humor. When I told Nathan about Ethan's decision, he was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. No argument, no disappointment, just understanding. The fight had finally left him. That night, for the first time since his diagnosis, Nathan cried openly in my arms, not for himself, but for Ethan, for the randomness of suffering, for the unfairness of timing, for the fragility of every plan humans dare to make. In grief, perspective arrives uninvited. Weeks passed. Chemotherapy began. Claire remained by Ethan's side. Nathan and I settled into a new rhythm, less strained, more honest. We started couples therapy, an overdue necessity. Our therapist, Dr. Holloway, possessed the unnerving ability to identify truths I had spent months avoiding. She pointed out that Nathan's proposal, however misguided, had been born not from selfishness, but from terror, and my resistance, while entirely justified, had been fueled partly by fear of losing the version of our marriage I had always known. Neither of us was wrong. Neither of us was entirely right. Marriage, it turns out, is less about perfect alignment and more about surviving each other's worst ideas. Then, just when life seemed to be stabilizing, Ethan called Nathan late one Thursday night. He wanted us both to come over, immediately. My stomach dropped. Bad news tends to arrive after dark. When we reached his house, Claire greeted us at the door, smiling through tears. Good tears. The scans after Ethan's second treatment showed an exceptional response. His prognosis, already optimistic, had become even better. The cancer was retreating faster than expected. Relief flooded the room so completely it felt physical. We celebrated with takeout, sparkling cider, and a ridiculous amount of cheesecake. At some point, after Claire and Ethan had gone to bed, Nathan and I stood alone in the kitchen. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in months. Peace. He apologized again, not out of obligation, out of clarity. He admitted that he had nearly destroyed our marriage trying to preserve the image of the future he had always imagined. And then he said the words I had needed most. He was ready for IVF, ready for donor conception, ready to let go of secrecy, ready to choose us over pride. I kissed him before he could say anything else, because growth deserves immediate reward. The fertility journey that followed was far from simple. Consultations, counseling, donor profiles, medical screenings, paperwork capable of suffocating entire forests. Nathan Ethan approached each step with humility that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. He even joked about it, a promising sign of emotional recovery. We selected a donor together, a strange, intimate process, choosing traits, reviewing medical histories, imagining possibilities. It wasn't the path we had originally envisioned, but it was ours, entirely ours. Or so I thought, because 2 days before our first scheduled procedure, Claire called me. Her voice was trembling. She had discovered something among Ethan's medical documents, something he had hidden from everyone, including Nathan, including me, and especially himself. Something that would force all of us to reconsider the choices we thought had already been made. I drove to Ethan's house in a state of focused panic. Claire had refused to explain over the phone, insisting only that it was important and that Ethan didn't yet know she had found it. The November sky hung low and gray, threatening snow. My hands tightened around the steering wheel the entire drive. When I arrived, Claire was waiting on the porch, wrapped in Ethan's old navy cardigan, her expression somewhere between disbelief and exasperation. She handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a fertility preservation report, dated 3 days before Ethan's first chemotherapy session. I skimmed the medical language twice before understanding what I was seeing. Ethan had banked sperm, several samples, comprehensive genetic screening included. Everything had been completed quietly, efficiently, and without telling anyone. My first reaction was practical. Of course he had. His oncologist had recommended it. My second reaction was far more complicated. He had preserved the very thing Nathan had once hoped to borrow, and he had done so at the precise moment he had declined to help us. Claire confirmed what I already suspected. Ethan had never mentioned it because he didn't want Nathan to feel pressured, indebted, or tempted to revisit the original arrangement. He had chosen silence to protect everyone, which in our strange orbit was becoming something of a theme. I laughed despite myself. Apparently, honesty had become our collective growth area. Claire did not laugh. She told me there was more. Tucked behind the medical paperwork was a sealed letter, addressed in Ethan's handwriting, to Nathan. Not if found, not in case, simply Nathan. Claire had opened it. Under normal circumstances, I might have objected. Given the circumstances, I was grateful. The letter was written the night before Ethan began treatment. It was equal parts humor, affection, and brutal honesty. Ethan acknowledged that life had recently become absurd enough to qualify as prestige television. He apologized for withdrawing. He admitted that his diagnosis had forced him to think deeply about legacy, mortality, and the people who mattered most. Then came the part that left me staring silently at the page. He had authorized Nathan and me to use one of his preserved samples if, at any point in the future, we still wished to pursue that path. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but as an intentional gift, made freely, with full legal documentation already prepared. A gift. That word hit differently than arrangement, favor, or solution. A gift implied generosity, without expectation. A gift could not be coerced. A gift changed everything. I read the letter twice, then a third time. My emotions tangled into something impossible to categorize. Relief, fear, gratitude, confusion, love, though not the kind people usually assume. Claire watched me carefully. She admitted Ethan likely never intended for the letter to surface unless his treatment went badly. It was a contingency plan born from vulnerability. Now that his prognosis was strong, he might never have shared it, which presented an ethical puzzle large enough to require its own zip code. Should we tell him we knew? Should Nathan read it? Should the possibility even be reopened now that we had chosen another path? I took the envelope home. Nathan was in the den, reviewing donor profiles on his laptop. He looked up, immediately sensing the gravity in my expression. I handed him the letter. He read it in complete silence. By the time he reached the final paragraph, his eyes had filled with tears. He folded the pages with extraordinary care, as though the paper itself were fragile. Then he laughed, a single disbelieving sound. "Only Ethan," he said. Only Ethan, indeed. For nearly an hour, we sat together without speaking. The room felt crowded by possibilities. The anonymous donor on Nathan's laptop, the known donor preserved in a clinic freezer, the history attached to one, the simplicity attached to the other. I asked Nathan what he wanted. His answer came slowly. Months earlier, he would have chosen Ethan instantly, driven by pride and desperation. Now, he wasn't sure, and that uncertainty was proof of how much he had changed. He no longer needed biology disguised as friendship. He simply wanted a family built on trust. The next evening, we visited Ethan and Claire. Nathan handed Ethan the letter. Watching Ethan realize Claire had discovered it was, under different circumstances, almost comical. He looked mildly betrayed, deeply embarrassed, and entirely unsurprised. After several minutes of mutual glaring and affectionate insults, the four of us finally sat down to talk. Really talk. No euphemisms, no avoidance, no strategic silences. Ethan explained that preserving samples had been medically prudent, nothing more. Writing the letter, however, had been emotional. He had spent one sleepless night confronting the possibility that treatment might fail. In that vulnerable state, he had wanted Nathan to know that the offer remained real, even if circumstances changed. He wanted Nathan to have options. He wanted me to have choices. He wanted no regrets. Claire squeezed his hand while he spoke. It was the kind of small, instinctive gesture that revealed everything words could not. Nathan asked the obvious question. If we chose Ethan now, how would Claire feel? She answered with a grace I am not sure I could have managed myself. She said that love was not diminished by helping people you cherish build something beautiful. Also, she added dryly, it was considerably less awkward when handled by a laboratory than by human scheduling. I nearly choked on my tea. The tension shattered. Laughter filled the room. And for the first time, the impossible felt almost ordinary. Almost. Nathan and I took another week before deciding. We met with our therapist. We met with our fertility specialist. We talked until words lost all structural integrity. Every angle mattered. Medical implications, emotional boundaries, future disclosure, the child's right to know their genetic origins, the role, if any, Ethan might play. Most importantly, whether choosing Ethan would truly reflect our present desires rather than our past wounds. That was the heart of it. Eventually, clarity emerged. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. We chose Ethan. Not because Nathan needed validation, not because Ethan owed us anything, not because anonymous donation was inadequate. We chose Ethan because the decision, once stripped of shame and desperation, felt grounded in love, trust, and transparency. It felt like family. The legal process was extensive. Psychological evaluations were mandatory. Our clinic, while surprised, handled the arrangement with impressive professionalism. Ethan passed every screening. Claire attended several appointments with us. At one point, the receptionist simply assumed we were an unusually close extended family. She wasn't entirely wrong. The first insemination attempt failed. So did the second. By the third, I had learned that hope can be both resilient and exhausting. Nathan accompanied me to every appointment. Ethan waited nervously in the lobby, pretending to read magazines from 2018. Claire brought snacks. It was, objectively, the strangest support system imaginable, and yet I have never felt more loved. 2 weeks after the third procedure, I took a pregnancy test at 6 in the morning. I had promised Nathan I would wait for him. I did not. Patience and fertility treatments are notoriously incompatible. The second line appeared slowly, then unmistakably positive. I sat on the bathroom floor and cried so hard that Nathan woke up before I could gather myself. He found me clutching the test with both hands, laughing and sobbing like a woman experiencing several emotions simultaneously, which, to be fair, I was. He knelt beside me. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. We simply stared at the tiny plastic stick, at each other, at the future. When we told Ethan and Claire later that day, Ethan actually sat down on the kitchen floor. Claire burst into tears. Nathan hugged his best friend with the kind of fierce gratitude that usually belongs in films. Our son was born 8 months later. Healthy, beautiful, perfectly loud. Nathan cut the cord. He held him first. He whispered through tears that he had waited his entire life for that moment. And in every way that mattered, he was that child's father. Entirely, completely, undeniably. We named him Oliver. Ethan became Uncle Ethan, exactly as planned. Nothing more, nothing less. Claire eventually became Aunt Claire, though Oliver insisted on calling her Cookie Lady until age 4. Life settled. Messy, joyful, sleep-deprived life. And for several years, I believed our extraordinary journey had finally reached its peaceful conclusion. I was wrong, because when Oliver turned 6, he came home from school one afternoon with a family tree assignment and one innocent question, a question that would force us to confront the one conversation we had postponed for far too long. There is no manual for explaining extraordinary beginnings to ordinary children. Parenting books cover sleep schedules, tantrums, picky eating, and the suspicious substances toddlers inevitably attempt to consume. They do not, unfortunately, provide a chapter titled How to Explain That Uncle Ethan Helped Create You. Perhaps an oversight. Oliver was 6 when the question arrived. He came bounding through the front door after school, backpack swinging wildly, cheeks flushed from playground conquest, clutching a worksheet decorated with construction paper leaves. A family tree assignment. Simple enough. Name your parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Add photos if possible. Then came the question. If Uncle Ethan isn't really related, why does everyone say he helped make me? My entire body froze. Apparently, 6-year-olds possess the hearing capabilities of surveillance equipment. Nathan looked up from the kitchen counter, where he had been unsuccessfully attempting to assemble a dinosaur-shaped sandwich. We had always planned to tell Oliver early. Age-appropriate honesty, our therapist had advised. Secrets have expiration dates. Unfortunately, parents also possess a remarkable talent for convincing themselves that later is a concrete strategy. It is not. Later eventually arrives carrying glue sticks and school assignments. Nathan and I exchanged the kind of glance married couples develop after years of surviving chaos together. The one that means, well, here we are. We sat Oliver at the kitchen table. He immediately requested apple slices, apparently believing all major life revelations should include snacks. A reasonable policy. I explained that some families need a little extra help to have children. Sometimes doctors help, sometimes special donors help. And in our case, Uncle Ethan gave us a gift long before Oliver was born. A gift that helped Mommy and Daddy become parents. Oliver considered this while crunching thoughtfully through an apple slice. Then he asked whether Ethan had wrapped it. Nathan laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. Children, mercifully, have an unmatched ability to puncture tension. We answered every question he asked. Simply, honestly, without oversharing. He wanted to know whether Nathan was still his real dad. Nathan told him that being a dad isn't about DNA. It's about bedtime stories, scraped knees, pancake Saturdays, and teaching someone how to ride a bike without crashing into Mrs. Henderson's mailbox twice. Oliver accepted this immediately. Children understand love far better than adults do. He also wanted to know whether Ethan was his bonus dad. Claire, when informed later, nearly framed that phrase. We settled on special uncle, which Oliver found satisfactory. Crisis averted. Or so we thought, because children process truth in layers. 3 weeks later, Oliver asked Ethan directly. They were building an elaborate Lego fortress in our living room when Oliver casually inquired whether Ethan had donated baby ingredients. I have never seen a grown man turn that particular shade of red. To Ethan's immense credit, he handled it beautifully. He confirmed that he had helped because he loved Nathan and me very much. Then Oliver, without missing a beat, asked whether that meant he inherited Ethan's terrible golf swing. Nathan laughed for a solid 5 minutes. Life moved forward. Oliver incorporated the truth into his understanding of himself with astonishing ease. For him, it wasn't scandalous. It was simply his story. Adults are the ones who complicate biology. Children care primarily about who shows up. Ethan showed up. Nathan showed up every single day. That was enough. Years passed. Oliver grew. Claire and Ethan married when he was 8, in a lakeside ceremony where Oliver served as ring bearer and nearly lost the rings while attempting to skip them across the water. They later had a daughter using Ethan's preserved samples. Watching Ethan become a father in his own right was one of the most profoundly healing experiences I've ever witnessed. Nathan cried harder at their daughter's birth than Ethan did. I am legally obligated as a wife to mention that. Our unconventional family became beautifully ordinary. Holiday dinners, soccer games, joint vacations, the sort of deeply intertwined life that would require color-coded charts to explain to strangers. And yet, it worked, because everyone involved had chosen honesty over ego. Eventually, not immediately. Humans, as a species, are excellent at taking the scenic route toward emotional maturity. Nathan and I often reflected on how close we had come to losing each other. His desperation could have destroyed us. My fear could have hardened into resentment. Instead, somehow, we emerged stronger. Not because the journey was easy, because it wasn't. Because love, when tested honestly, either fractures completely or reforges itself into something stronger than naive certainty. Ours reforged. On our 15th wedding anniversary, Nathan gave me a handwritten letter, a tradition he had maintained ever since the night he first apologized all those years earlier. In that letter, he confessed something I had long suspected. He had never truly been afraid of infertility. He had been afraid of being unnecessary, of becoming less of a man, less worthy of love, less essential to our future. Fatherhood cured none of that, but living it taught him the truth. Oliver did not need Nathan's genetics. He needed Nathan. And Nathan, in turn, needed Oliver far more than biology ever could have predicted. When Oliver turned 16, we revisited the story in fuller detail. Teenagers demand nuance the way toddlers demand snacks. He appreciated the trust. He also found the original proposal hilariously horrifying. His exact words were, "So Dad basically suggested the weirdest group project ever." An unfair but technically accurate summary. He adored telling close friends that his family tree required explanatory footnotes. I suspect therapists will one day benefit financially from his sense of humor. As for Ethan, his cancer has remained in remission for over a decade. Every annual checkup still tightens all our nerves. Some scars never fully fade, nor should they. They remind us what mattered enough to fight for. Claire remains one of my closest friends, which is perhaps the most unexpected outcome of all. The woman who once arrived on my porch during a thunderstorm became family. Life has excellent writers. Years later, when people ask me whether I would make the same choice again, my answer is immediate. Yes, not because every moment was graceful. Many were awkward, painful, and occasionally absurd, but because the result is Oliver, because Nathan became the father he was always meant to be, because Ethan survived, because Claire stayed, because love expanded rather than divided, and because families are not defined by conventional beginnings. They are defined by commitment, by truth, by the people who remain. If there is a lesson buried inside this confession, it is this. The worst moment of your marriage does not have to become its ending. Sometimes it becomes the doorway to a version of yourselves you could never have imagined. A stronger version, a humbler version, a version capable of asking impossible questions and surviving the answers. Nathan once believed fatherhood required his DNA. He was wrong. I once believed trust, once cracked, could never fully heal. I was wrong too. And Ethan believed one sleepless night and a frozen sample would likely never matter. Oliver, currently 6 feet tall and raiding our refrigerator with the efficiency of a small army, would strongly disagree. So that's my confession. My husband asked me to carry another man's child. I almost lost myself in the request. Instead, I found a larger, stranger, more beautiful family than I ever thought possible. And every single time Oliver smiles, I know with absolute certainty that some of life's most extraordinary gifts arrive wrapped in circumstances you would never choose, but would never undo.